All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back with another episode on the Abrasive Conversations platform. And this month, we would like to have a heritage celebration. So during this month, we're going to release episodes where we are going to highlight some of the amazing work that people are doing in the heritage sector. It's not necessarily heritage like you go to a heritage office, but it's relating to the idea of how heritage is supposed to look like. So the first person on this series this month is Lukretia Booysen. Lukretia, thank you for joining Abrasive Conversation.
Thank you so much for giving me the honor of being on your podcast.
Lukretia, thank you. I've been following your work for a while, and I've been in this space before, and I've really had a close eye on the work that you guys have been doing. And as I've introduced to the audience, this is Heritage Month. Every year, September, we have Heritage Month. What does this month mean to you as a member of the Khoekhoe and San community?
So, Heritage Month, let me just start by we celebrate Heritage Day every single day because we work in, the preservation of Khoekhoe and San culture through the arts. But this month, I think, is very important because in South Africa, Heritage Month is the only time when people actually come out and they celebrate each other's heritages, and that's something that people don't necessarily take cognizance of. But yeah, that's what Heritage Month basically means. And celebration to me is the key when it comes to heritage because, your heritage is, one, you honor it, and number two, you celebrate it. But Heritage Month in South Africa, we celebrate each other's heritage.
I fully agree. It is a celebration of other people, and I've seen it over the years that this cross-cultural celebration and cross-heritage celebration over the years. But you are a member of the Khoekhoe and San community, and the Khoekhoe and San community have so much to offer. Heritage. Where do you think the focus should be this year?
So for the Koena Art Institute, our focus this coming year is going to be a bit of a lot of things. Number one is obviously showcasing new artists, new works. But we also are going to look at the resurgence of Indigenous communities now in the contemporary society and what that means to our community. And it's like over the last couple of years, I've been doing heritage preservation for a decade now. And in the last couple of years, we've seen an uprise of Indigenous communities and speaking out and, coming to the fore, celebrating themselves as Indigenous communities. So we want to through art, have a bit of a focus on that. Because, in, the broader landscape, all of, our contemporary society have questions, why now? What's happening? Because not everybody's, on the same page when it comes to this resurgence, but we want to look at the finer details of it and how we can, reflect that through art.
I'm glad you're talking about the resurgence and what people are seeing as a resurgence, but you have been doing, and many of these communities have been doing this work for so long. It's just finally you get into the public space, or there's the attention turned to you, and then it's sometimes seen as this resurgence. And I'm glad that you're pointing this out. But as you know, we have heritage, and it's both physical and metaphysical. So let's talk about Indigenous art. What is Indigenous art, and why is it so important to reserve?
Okay, so, to me, as the curator of the Koena Art Institute, Indigenous art is exactly what it says it is. It is art that is created by Indigenous people, which tells Indigenous stories. And it tells Indigenous stories of the time. You understand? Because when we look at rock art was art that told stories of the times, because that's what the artist does. The artist sees its environment and it creates based on that. It creates, or they, or them. The artists, they create based on the immediate environment, how they project it, how they see society, how they see the world. Obviously, some artists, they focus on historical works. Some artists focus on, whatever thematic time or period they choose to paint in or sculpt in. But essentially, it is always a representation of their time and of their views of a specific topic or subject matter. So Indigenous art is exactly that. It's art created by Indigenous people.
I love it. I love your explanation of Indigenous art, and I think it might be one of the best I've heard, because the way you describe art is this timely stories that's being told. And you also, for me, brilliantly put rock art in a particular context, because there is that perception that art, especially when you think about art from the Khoekhoe and San communities, that they have to look like rock art. But it's not necessarily. It's a timely expression of stories. So thank you for that, and I know it's going to help a lot of people to make sense of the work that they're going to experience at the Institute. So, as you've mentioned before, is that you have mentioned the Koena Art Institute, and you're the founder of it. So please tell us more about your work, and why did you start it?
Okay, so the Koena Art Institute is an organization that focuses on Indigenous heritage, Khoekhoe and San, Indigenous heritage preservation through arts. And it is basically a space for celebrating and appreciating and sharing Indigenous stories through the art that is being, presented by the artworks or the artists that we work with and collaborate with, and that we have the privilege of representing. So it was quite a journey to the space. Like right now, we're at the Castle of Groot. Who would have thought? When I started, this was not even, I didn't even think that this was a possibility. And we also have a space at Seven Sisters in Stellenbosch. We are also now busy in talks of opening a new branch in Austria. So yeah, we are essentially expanding, and it's all about cultural celebration and sharing the richness and the wealth of our culture through us as people. And so I started when I was sitting with my friends when I was still staying in Pretoria, and it was around Heritage Month. And everybody was deciding on what they were going to wear for Heritage Month. And this is probably about 13 years ago. And I was sitting with my friends, and when you're in Pretoria and Gauteng, and when you're up north, unlike in the Western Cape, at that time, people are very much, into the pride that they have in their culture, in their origins, and the food that they eat, the way that they dress. When it comes to Heritage Month, woo, people show up. And I was sitting and I was like, yo guys, when I look at my community at that time, the representation of what they wore was not necessarily who they were. And I was like, but maybe I should want to do that for myself. And then I actually wore Indigenous regalia, did a photo shoot, and put it on Facebook. And that picture went viral. And people from Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, every part of South Africa was asking me, where did you get this? I would like to have it. And then I realized that I was not the only one who felt that I want to celebrate my heritage. And, I started a clothing brand called Khoekhoe. And then I started creating Indigenous foods. And I sold the food that was inspired, but more modern, like I had a modern idea of what it meant to be an Indigenous Khoekhoe and San person in the contemporary South African society. So I sold, more modern kind of foods at social markets. And then I started activism for, heritage preservation. Then I started an organization called the Khoisan Youth Empowerment Movement. And that was with a lot of young activists from across South Africa. And we were doing a lot. So I was very much involved in our communities. But then I started to move away from activism because I realized that activism is a very aggressive environment. And I did not necessarily want to be in an environment where culture is seen as a fight. I wanted to be in an environment where, as I wanted to do in the first place, celebrate heritage. And then I was continuing, doing all of these events. And then I started doing Indigenous experiences where I would pair food and music and obviously clothing sales and all of that with, I'd find a beautiful space and turn it into an experience, an Indigenous experience. And at one point, I got a call from an artist. His name is Stanley Grootboom. And it's actually the artwork I'm sitting in front of. And Stanley said to me, "Hi, Lukretia, how are you?" And I'm like, "I'm well." And he's like, I've been following your work for a while. And I'm an artist. And I would like you to represent me as an artist. And I was like, art? I never sold. I was like, I wouldn't even know where to start. And he was like, "But I think that you would be the right person. I would like you to represent me, and I will leave the gallery that I'm with today if you would say yes." And then I thought about it and I was like, okay, let me at least try, because I've got a motto that is trying is winning. I'd rather try and fail than not try. And I was like, okay, cool, I'll try. And within the first 2 weeks, I sold my first art piece for 26,000 Rand. And I made a 30% commission on that artwork. And that was quite a big amount. And I was like, if I sell one art piece for this amount, I'm not going to look back. And then I became a dealer. I was selling artworks. And then I married art, music, food, beautiful spaces, and would take this Indigenous art experience to different places until I decided to come to Cape Town, because at the time I was in Pretoria. And I found this little place in Observatory, and they were having pop-up exhibitions, and you could rent out the space for a week. And I found it, and it was within my pockets capabilities. And I booked the space, the pop-up place in Observatory, and we went and we hosted an exhibition for a week. In our opening night, we were the highest selling exhibition in the space for the time that it's been there. We did our thing, we left. And when I got back to Pretoria, the owner called me a couple of weeks later and he said, "Lukretia, have you ever thought about doing something more permanent?" And I was like, no, not really. I was thinking that, because my plan was to take this Indigenous art experience, this curated Indigenous experience around the world or around the country. And then he asked me, "Have you ever thought of doing something permanent?" And I was like, no. And I spoke to my mom and I was like, "Mommy, what do you think about me opening a gallery?" She's like, "If you want to do it." And I took the little money that I've saved up and I paid I made up my mind and I said, okay, Werner Stein, I would like to pay upfront for 3 months rent and let's see how it goes. And we then opened the Koena Art Institute in Observatory. And it was basically in the heart of of COVID. And today we're at the Castle of Grip. The rest is history.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's a beautiful story. Just a journey. And thank you for the openness in sharing this particular journey, because one thing I've realized is that not a lot of people are willing to sit down with people so that they can tell their story, go on to these various, they just want to knip, the snippet and the clip it and then send it onto the media. And this is a beautiful story, that journey that you took. And I love it. I love it that you went to art, because one of the things that I'm so interested in is the pre-colonial philosophy. And I think art, culture, heritage give us insight into a pre-colonial African philosophy, where preservation, living with nature and all of those things was already thought of, and then we lived with it. And the painting that you sit in front of is telling that type of story, the rupture and the things that is happening. So thank you for telling that particular story. But, ladies and gentlemen, that's not all that the Koena Art Institute is. They're also offering UNDRIP education sessions, and that is the facilitator of the discussion is Professor Jeremy Klaasen. Please tell me more about that specific work and how did they came to life.
Okay, so amongst having our daily installations, exhibitions, we also obviously do other cultural preservation events. Sometimes we do Indigenous film screenings, where it's films that's created by Indigenous people. We tell stories, with the likes of Dieuwke-Jean. We just had Indigenous Film Month this past month, where we showcased a few Indigenous stories, also raising funds for Molo Songololo, which is one of the organizations that is very dear to our hearts. But yes, we also do UNDRIP education sessions, and it started because I was an Indigenous Fellow, United Nations Indigenous Fellow. I was actually invited to be a fellow by the United Nations themselves. And when they asked me, I was like, me? And they're like, yes, you. We've identified you. You are the person. And I was like, okay, but I have no interest in politics. And they told me, but it's not about politics. We would just like you to come in. I was pleasantly surprised and introduced to a completely new understanding of not only the Indigenous landscape, but also the role that we as Indigenous people who have access to our communities can play in terms of education on how the states and how the world, the global society, and now the global Indigenous community can be positively impacted by tools and mechanisms that are available to Indigenous people that they might not have known about if they were not informed. So I was a 2023 United Nations Fellow, and I was in Geneva, Switzerland, where we received the most amazing Indigenous rights education training under the guidance of Mors Flores, who's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Indigenous representative on the United Nations, in the United Nations body. And I came back and I was like, now I know so much. I need to, transfer or find people that would be willing to help transfer the information that I received. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is obviously UNDRIP, is what we decided to give lectures on, not necessarily meetings or workshops, but just lectures on to inform our community of the mechanisms that are available to them that will essentially empower them. economically, will empower them to or help them facilitate preservation of spaces, lands, and how they can become a part of the broader scope, when it comes to topics that affect them directly. So every month from June this year, we've been having lectures which were completely free in the space for all Indigenous people, not only Khoekhoe and San Indigenous people, but all Indigenous communities who were interested in educating themselves on their rights as Indigenous peoples. And our specific focus this year was biodiversity, because we have so much, there's such a broad biodiversity landscape in South Africa, and how biodiversity equates to, money, medicine, teas, all of these product offerings that we see today, like rooibos tea, when we look at sand parks, when we look at our herbs, medicinal herbs, buchu, and all of those kinds of things, and how they are now new mechanisms and obviously offerings in our state where our people should be participating, but they aren't. So just basically providing access to information, let them know what the tools are that you can use, how do you go about these things. So basically our sessions are more about sharing the tools, also creating an understanding of what it means and how to get and become a part of the system that's already existing. So yeah, that is what we've been doing. So next year we have a different focus that will be presented by Miles Jacobs, starting from June up to the end of September, every first Saturday of the month. And we will then next year, we will be focusing on territories. So every year we focus on different elements of Indigenous people's rights and the tools that Indigenous people can use to access specific, things that will benefit them and their communities, essentially.
Amazing. I'm sitting here and I was like, oh, that's a great backstory. The Geneva and the fellowship.
Yeah.
And it also reveals the multifaceted person that you are, Lukretia. You are not just locally, but you're also internationally. And the other thing that I appreciate, you also recognize the other Indigenous groups in South Africa, because sometimes it becomes and that you actually say, look, the space is open to other Indigenous groups. So I appreciate that. But you see, this multifaceted person, people, there's more to her. She's also recently appointed on the PENSHAB board. PENSHAB is the language board of South Africa, where they are tasked to preserve Indigenous languages and develop Indigenous languages in South Africa. So, and this is a question I have for you, since you start this new role now. Do you think we're doing enough to preserve our languages? Why would, why?
Well, in terms of the preservation of Indigenous languages in South Africa, we are absolutely not doing enough. And I also want to acknowledge all of the work that has been done that aid, preservation of languages. But, and this is my personal opinion, the mechanisms that have been put in place when it comes to preserving languages have been more research-based and not necessarily on the ground, person-to-person based, right? So a lot of focus is being put on recording languages, and but there's not a lot of focus being put on teaching children and people how to speak, how to pronounce. So that is one thing that I personally would like to promote more, in my role at PANSALB. But I also feel like so much, is, and this is going to be my honest opinion, and I would apologize if, anyone would disagree with me. If we take an example, like Oma Katrina Iso, who speaks Nu, and she is the last known fluent speaker of this language. And she has been known by the last 4 presidents of South Africa. And she has received awards, doctorates. But when you talk about actual impact work, that where investment could have been put behind aiding the preservation with her and her granddaughter and the team that's around, I think that could have been done so much better. And I also think that it is very sad to see the amount of resources that has been put around aiding. The focus, as I said, has more been put on recording as opposed to teaching the language. So that would be my critique of, the current efforts that are being put into preserving Indigenous languages. And that's something that, I would like to see change. So yeah, that would be definitely one of the things that I'm going to be advocating for in my sitting at, the language board, but also the recognition and the South Africa needs to at least have one, if not all, Indigenous languages made official. I'm going to advocate for that more than anything else, because how the state works is the state only will take responsibility for things that they actually recognize. And once an Indigenous language is official, that will then require the state to implement programs of redress. And that obviously would then look at, a broad number of things. But I think that would be something that I would definitely want to focus on.
I hear what you're saying in terms of the language. Where do you think the efforts, you've talked about the investment in the resources and what you personally would like to do, but we always have a term or preference. So in your term, you said you're going to advocate for that we push for more Indigenous languages like your Nama, your Khung, Kwedam, and Ngu languages to get into it. But once, let's say, you are successful in your push, what is our responsibility as a broader South African towards preserving this particular heritage? What should we do?
And this is my opinion. Yeah. I think what a lot of people don't understand is that when we look at each other as South African communities and South African tribes and, people who speak these different languages, each community is responsible for the preservation of their languages. But South African heritage, just like Khoekhoe and San heritage, is every South African's heritage. You understand what I'm saying? When I look at Zulu communities, Xhosa communities, Phiri, Tswana, all of that is a part of my intrinsic heritage as a South African. And I think that patriotism is something that us as South Africans have to learn to practice more in our comings and goings. Because if one language that is South African goes extinct, all of us indirectly have a responsibility as to why it went extinct and why did we not preserve that piece of ourselves. So I think that it's something like preserving a language that's endangered. It's a big task. It's a big task. So there wouldn't be one easy answer to say this is what, everybody needs to do. But I think that what's important is that we all as South Africans take cognizance of the importance of each and every culture and each and every language in our country. And essentially that will definitely lead to a more loving South African society.
I appreciate that you say heritage is owned by everyone. It's not one, it's a South African heritage. it's part of that melting pot. So I appreciate that, and I hope that people also see it the way that you put it, is that yes, even though I am in this particular community, this is my tradition, this is my culture, but this is also my heritage that I'm giving to a broader South African heritage. So all of these bits and pieces actually make it South African heritage. So, staying on the topic of heritage, do you think that our government is doing enough to preserve heritage? And heritage is big. Like you said, you are already in this institute, have been looking at biodiversity for the past 4 months. So do you, in the bigger scope of heritage, do you think our government is doing enough?
I think that our governments are trying their best. I think that, it's like sometimes our expectations versus what is actually possible, those two don't match up. I always, also get frustrated. I get very frustrated with our government because they're not doing this and they're supposed to be doing this. And then I also realized that me as a South African citizen also has a responsibility towards, the movement of where our South Africa is going. But I also think at the same time that, our South African government could, have more strategic ways of doing it and more intentional ways, more, outcomes-based driven, ways of approaching heritage in South Africa, and also collaborative ways of preserving heritage, in our country, because I also feel like the government does not engage and collaborate with the communities affected that they would like to, obviously build enough. I think that there's almost like this way linear approach and not necessarily a say let's go together approach. And I think that should be encouraged more to our government. But we've got a GNU now, so let's see how the GNU does.
The GNU.
Yes.
Government of National Unity.
It is what it is. So
it is what it is.
Let's be positive about it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're almost at the end of our conversation, and I would like Lukretia to spotlight. Now, it's almost unfair for her to spotlight because I'm sitting in this beautiful gallery, and she is spotlighting people, like all over, different artists. So I will be a little bit unfair, and please forgive me. It's not her, it's me. So if you're the artist listening, please don't feel away. But I'm asking an unfair question, and she has a choice, but I would like her to spotlight someone. So the artist is already spotlight. So someone else that you would like to spotlight for this particular month.
Wow, that's a tough one for me because I work with the most amazing artists. I work with the most amazing community. I have so many amazing mentors. I've got so many amazing, people that I know that are doing so much, not just for the Indigenous queer community, but for society. There's so many people that I would love to spotlight, but I think in honor of, preserving languages, Indigenous languages, and focusing on the Mu language, I would like to spotlight not Oma Katrina, but her granddaughter, Claudia Snyman. So Claudia is the granddaughter of Oma Katrina, who is now the last known fluent Mu speaker. But the language has been transferred to Claudia. And the narrative that is being, projected out into the global, society, because Oma is a global figure. Everybody around the world knows about the Mu language being at near extinction. And, but it's not, because that knowledge has been passed on to Claudia. And Claudia has been advocating, and she still will be advocating for the preservation of this language once her grandmother is not there anymore. So I would like to also focus on that transfer of knowledge that has been passed on to Claudia. And once Oma is not there, there will still be someone. I almost take it back to what happened to Indigenous communities, Indigenous Khoekhoe and San communities. They said, oh, everybody was extinct. And that wasn't accurate because we're still here. It's a contemporary South African society. We might not dress the same or act the same. And yes, there's been some mixing, but that does not take away from the fact that we are Indigenous peoples. And just because Oma, is the last known and celebrated fluent speaker, let's not ignore the fact that she has a granddaughter who speaks the language and who walked the journey with Oma as she was doing her advocacy. As Oma was teaching, she was a co-teacher. There's also other parties that have been working with Oma. But Claudia essentially is the keeper of that language once Oma is not there anymore. And she will be the person that will continue to carry on that language once Oma is not there anymore. So it's for me, I always wanted to highlight, the person that is going to take things forward. So Claudia Snyman is that person for me.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, and you heard now, please give attention to Claudia Snyman. So what I would like you to do, if you listen to this, go and Google Claudia Snyman. And if you Google Claudia Snyman, she most probably will came up in the Al Jazeera documentary, like I think a 7 or 9 minute documentary, where they show how Oma Katrina is transferring the language to Claudia and how Claudia is transferring the language to other speakers, which is much younger than Claudia herself. And I'm so glad you said something earlier, is that there needs to be more investment. So there needs to be more investment going Claudia's way to help the efforts. So there needs to be more films, there needs to be more children's book, there needs to be dictionaries that kids can understand, there needs to be app development, there needs to be websites. So there's so much more that can be done. And if you listen to this and you can pull some strings, check out Claudia and put up your hands and say that I'm going to help.
So just, to complement what you say, or just to add to what you're saying, those things have already been done. There are books, there is a dictionary, there's an app, there is language platforms, there's many e-resources that Claudia and Oma and many other organizations, also with Pansalba has been doing. There's films, there's so many resources that have already been, developed. What I think is important is providing investment in terms of aiding actionable, things that, like what I mentioned with how the language is not being taught in schools. Like these books that have been developed should be put in primary schools, like children's book. There's a new children's book called Skilpad and Volstreis. And those should be put into the education system. And these consonants and vowels and clicks and how the pronunciation of the words, can be taught because Claudia is there. The dictionary called Sasi Epsi that has Oma's obviously the language recorded on there also has voice. So you actually hear Oma's voice on the dictionary and the pronunciation of the words. So there are so many resources that have already been invested in from our state. And obviously, people that have been working in the language activism space and, cultural preservation space. But it's not being marketed well enough, and it's not being implemented and put into action. So I think that resources should be directed into getting people to speak the language as opposed to creating more books and more, content, because there is already existing content.
So ladies and gentlemen, there you hear it. We have the resources, the content is there. So where the help now is like Lukretia means that it needs to go into school. It needs to go into a larger media. It needs to get out there. There needs to be actionable steps, as you put it. So if you can help with the actionable steps, please reach out to Claudia. But only if you are willing to put time and energy in helping realizing that. Don't just reach out and then there is no actionable step, because that's the other thing. People do reach out, and I do appreciate those people that reach out. But when you reach out, put up your hand and say, how many schools do I have to drive to, or how many books can I print with this money, and how can I get it out to those schools? Those are the actionable steps, if I get you right.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And maybe record Oma, read the book, and when you take the books to schools, have them project Oma reading the book so people can actually hear the pronunciation of the words, you know. So here at the castle, we have a lot of young people that come through the space, and, you know, when they come, I would, you know, teach them basic new words. And the other day we had a group of kids, I think they were about 6, 7 years old, and, you know, so in Mu, Goinkia means hello, and Goinkia also means goodbye. And those kids were goinkiaing from the moment they left here all the way around the castle, because after them being here, they go to the other museums in the space, and I went to the store and I walked back, and then as I was walking back to the space, I just said, Goinkia! A lot of them screaming, Goinkia! From the other side of the castle. And, you know, children, they remember things. And so just that little bit of information, they appreciate it so much, and they implement it, you know. And I mean, like, who else heard them scream? Like a whole bunch of little kids screaming Goinkia, and everybody was probably wondering, what is that? But they knew, and they will be telling other people. So actionable and outcome-based driven work is essentially what we should really, really try and, you know, invest in.
Ladies and gentlemen, we came to the end of this brilliant conversation with Lukretia. And I think by now you're wondering, how do I get hold of Lukretia, and how can I witness the work that she's doing? So I'm giving it over to Lukretia. Where can people find you?
So we are based at the Castle of Grootboom. And also we have an art showroom at Seven Sisters Vineyards in Stellenbosch. A little bit about Seven Sisters. Seven Sisters Vineyards is the first brown female-owned wine farm in the Western Cape. So it's such a privilege, you know, as a brown woman, to be in a space that encourages female entrepreneurship. Seven Sisters Vineyards, we are also on Facebook, Koena Art Institute. We are on Instagram, Koena Art Institute, and people are welcome to email us, info@koenaartinstitute.co.za. And when we think about the spelling, it's Koena artinstitute.co.za. So Koena Art Institute on Facebook, Instagram, and email.
And what I will do for you, ladies and gentlemen, I would also put this in the description for you. So
Thank you.
You can just click down and check in the description. You can click some of the links. Lukretia, thank you for joining us.
Much.
And thank you for the wonderful work that you're doing.
It's an honor.